We thought renting a secluded cabin hidden behind a suffocating wall of ancient pine trees would be the perfect quiet getaway. We had absolutely no idea that for our entire trip, we would be sharing that tiny, isolated space with a predator who was standing in the dark, quietly watching us sleep. I have always despised traveling, especially for work. The airports, the endless highways, the uncomfortable hotel beds, it all exhausts me. So, when I was assigned a project in a beautifully remote, heavily forested region about 3 hours from our home, I decided to try and make the best of a bad situation. I invited my wife to come along. She hated whenever my job pulled me away, and I figured this would be the perfect excuse to turn a mandatory corporate trip into a much-needed romantic retreat. I pictured her spending her afternoons exploring the quaint local shops, hiking the nearby scenic trails, or just relaxing with a book while I finished my meetings. I would be back every evening, and we would have the nights completely to ourselves. We bypassed the standard, crowded chain hotels in the center of town and booked a charming, rustic little house on the absolute outskirts of the county. The listing described it as a private nature retreat. When we finally pulled up the long, unpaved gravel driveway, I realized private was an understatement. The cabin was completely swallowed by a dense, towering perimeter of thick trees. It wasn't exactly 100 miles from civilization, but the sheer density of the woods made it feel like we were the only two people left on the face of the earth. The nearest neighbor was completely out of sight. When we stepped inside on that first evening, the house felt incredibly welcoming. It was small, cozy, and filled with old wooden furniture. My wife immediately fell in love with it, tracing her hands over the countertops and joking that we should put in an offer to buy the place. The only slightly unnerving feature of the house was a massive unfinished basement directly beneath the living room, filled ceiling to floor with the owner's locked storage cabinets. But we brushed it off. We unpacked our bags, settled in, and went to sleep, completely oblivious to the fact that our peaceful vacation was already over. The very first morning, the illusion of safety shattered. I woke up at 6:00 a.m. sharp to the harsh buzzing of my alarm, reaching across the cold sheets to shut it off. That's when I noticed the bed next to me was completely empty. The sheets were pulled back, the air in the room completely still. I dragged myself out of bed, a strange knot forming in my stomach, and walked down the short, creaky hallway toward the kitchen. I found my wife sitting silently on a wooden bar stool in the pitch dark. The only light in the room was the pale, ghostly glow of her cell phone screen illuminating her face. She looked absolutely drained. Her skin was pale, and her eyes were wide and bloodshot. When I softly asked her why she was awake so early, her voice trembled. She told me she hadn't slept for hours. Sometime in the dead of the night, long before the sun even considered rising, she had woken up to a feeling of overwhelming dread. The room was suffocatingly dark. As her eyes slowly adjusted to the heavy blackness, she rolled over and looked toward the corner of the bedroom. Standing right there, perfectly camouflaged in the deepest shadows, was the silhouette of a person. She told me her heart stopped beating. She tried to convince herself it was just a coat hanging on a chair, or an optical illusion created by the moonlight slipping through the blinds. She squinted, paralyzed by a primal fear, desperately trying to focus her vision. It was just too dark to be certain. She rolled over, squeezing her eyes shut, silently praying it was just her imagination running wild. But right as her exhaustion began to pull her back to sleep, the heavy silence of the room was broken. She heard a deliberate, creeping rustle, a heavy shift in weight coming from that exact same corner. She bolted out of bed, sprinted to the kitchen, turned on the coffee maker, and hadn't moved since. I felt terrible for her, but my logical brain took over. I assured her it was just the stress of a new environment, the strange noises of an old, settling house playing tricks on her mind. I kissed her goodbye, grabbed my briefcase, and headed out for my meetings, promising we would have a great dinner that night. But things didn't get better. They escalated. While I was stuck in a conference room, my wife decided to take a long, hot shower to wash off the anxiety of the morning. Before getting in, she carefully took her fresh clothes from her suitcase and laid them out on the very edge of the bed. She folded them perfectly, stacking them in a neat, organized pile with her favorite pair of thick socks resting right on top. She locked the bathroom door, turned on the water, and tried to relax. 20 minutes later, she stepped out of the bathroom, a towel wrapped tightly around her waist, and froze dead in her tracks. Her clothes were no longer stacked neatly on the edge of the mattress. Someone had touched them. The entire pile had been disturbed. Each piece of clothing had been taken, haphazardly folded entirely in half, and carelessly thrown back onto the bed in a strange, single-file line. But that wasn't the detail that made her stomach turn. The thick socks she had placed right on the very top of the pile were completely gone. Vanished. She tore apart the sheets, checked under the bed, and scoured her suitcase, feeling a wave of absolute hysteria washing over her. She knew exactly where she had left them. She threw on her bizarrely rearranged clothes, grabbed her purse, and ran out the front door, slamming it behind her. She was so completely terrified of being inside that cabin alone that she refused to wait for me. She ordered an Uber to pick her up at the edge of the driveway and fled into town. When I finally met up with her for lunch at a crowded diner downtown, she looked like she had seen a ghost. Her hands were shaking as she held her coffee mug, giving me short, one-word answers before finally breaking down and explaining the situation with her clothes. I honestly didn't know what to say. I didn't think she was crazy, but I also couldn't wrap my head around the logistics. A ghost doesn't steal your socks. An intruder wouldn't take the time to fold your jeans in half. It made absolutely zero sense. We spent the rest of the afternoon walking around the busy town center, surrounded by people, trying to flush the lingering dread out of our systems. By the time the sun set, she seemed to be doing much better. We drove back to the cabin together, ate a warm dinner, and convinced ourselves that tomorrow would be a fresh start. We were so incredibly wrong. That night, the atmosphere in the house felt heavy, almost suffocating. We were laying in bed in the dark, the absolute silence of the woods pressing against the windows. Sometime past 2 a.m., she aggressively shook my shoulder. I woke up startled, my eyes wide open in the dark. She was gripping my arm with bruising force, tears streaming down her face. She frantically shushed me and pointed toward the floor. Then, I heard it. Right beneath us, coming from the massive, unfinished basement, was the heavy, unmistakable sound of footsteps. It wasn't a pipe groaning. It wasn't wood settling. It was the slow, deliberate thud of heavy boots slowly pacing across the concrete floor. Thud. Pause. Thud. My blood ran completely cold. My wife was hyperventilating, aggressively begging me not to leave the bed, pleading with me to just call the police and lock the bedroom door. But the terrifying uncertainty was eating me alive. I had to know if our sanctuary had actually been breached. I grabbed the heaviest object I could find, a thick metal flashlight from the nightstand, and quietly crept out of the bedroom. I moved silently through the dark hallway, every single creak of the floorboards sounding like a gunshot in my ears. I reached the door to the basement. It was slightly ajar. I took a deep, trembling breath and pushed the door open, slowly descending the wooden stairs. The air down there was damp, freezing, and smelled heavily of mildew and old cardboard. I fumbled for the light switch at the bottom of the stairs and flicked it up. A single, pathetic, dim yellow bulb flickered to life, casting long, distorted, monstrous shadows across the endless stacks of storage boxes. I tightened my grip on the flashlight and slowly walked through the maze of clutter, checking behind every shelf and inside every open cabinet. Nothing. The basement was completely empty. The silence was deafening. I let out a massive sigh of relief, lowering my flashlight. I actually started to laugh at my own paranoia, convincing myself that the sound was just the heating unit kicking on in the cold night. I turned my back to the room and started walking toward the stairs. But right as I grabbed the wooden handrail, the hairs on the back of my neck stood straight up. A primal alarm bell rang in my brain. I stopped dead in my tracks, slowly turning my head to look back into the furthest, darkest corner of the basement. A corner the weak yellow light couldn't quite reach. Standing completely motionless in the shadows, sandwiched between two large storage boxes, was a tall man. He was wearing a faded, dirty red baseball cap pulled low over his face. His arms were hanging limply at his sides. He was so incredibly, unnaturally still that my brain violently rejected what I was seeing. My mind screamed that it was just a coat rack, or maybe a strange life-sized mannequin the owners had stored away. I stood there, frozen in sheer terror, staring intensely at the dark figure, waiting for my eyes to adjust. Then, the terrifying silence broke. The floorboards under the figure groaned. The man slowly shifted his weight forward, leaning slightly out of the shadows and directly into the dim yellow light. He slowly tilted his head up, looked me dead in the eyes, and blinked. Pure, unadulterated panic exploded in my chest. I didn't yell. I didn't speak. I spun around and scrambled up the wooden stairs so fast I tore the skin off my knuckles against the rough wall. I burst through the basement door, sprinted down the hallway, and crashed into the bedroom. I screamed at my wife to grab her shoes and get out of the house immediately. I didn't care about packing. I didn't care about folding. I grabbed the 3 heavy duffel bags, dragging them violently across the floor, and threw them out the front door into the freezing night air. My wife was sobbing, throwing the bags into the trunk of our car, while I sprinted back inside one last time to rip our phone chargers out of the wall. As I ran past the living room, heading for the front door, I glanced back. The basement door was now swung completely wide open. I didn't stop to look down the stairs. I launched myself through the front door, slammed it shut, threw the car into drive, and tore out of the gravel driveway, spinning tires in the dirt. We drove for miles in complete silence, our hearts hammering in our chests, the terrifying realization slowly washing over us. That man hadn't just broken in. He had been there the entire time. He was the shadow in the bedroom. He was the one who folded her clothes and stole her socks. We had spent an entire weekend locked inside an isolated cabin with a predator who was quietly roaming the halls while we slept. I used to deeply believe that true danger only existed in isolated, run-down places. I convinced myself that if you paid enough money, if you surrounded yourself with luxury and security guards and 5-star amenities, you could buy a protective shield against the dark and twisted things in the world. I was dead wrong. Paying for luxury doesn't keep the monsters away. Sometimes it just gives them a much nicer hunting ground. A few years ago, I started dating a girl named Julie. Things were going incredibly well, so we decided to book a lavish trip to an exclusive 4 Seasons resort in Costa Rica. From the moment we arrived, it felt like we had stepped into an untouchable paradise. The resort was absolutely stunning, featuring massive infinity pools, impeccable room service, and private, standalone suites that backed up directly against the dense, untamed Costa Rican jungle. For the first 3 days, we completely disconnected from reality. We drank expensive cocktails, swam in the crystal-clear ocean, and let our guards down completely. We felt entirely insulated from the real world. On our 3rd night, the atmosphere shifted. We had spent the evening enjoying an extravagant dinner and watching a mesmerizing fire dancing performance on the beach. By the time the show ended, it was incredibly late. The expansive resort, usually bustling with guests and staff, had grown eerily quiet. The massive swimming pools and common areas were completely deserted. The tropical air was thick, humid, and heavy with the scent of salt water and blooming flowers. We were buzzing with energy, so we grabbed a bottle of tequila and some mixers from our room and sneaked out to a secluded hot tub tucked away near the edge of the property. It was a beautiful, intimate spot, almost entirely enclosed by a thick wall of towering jungle plants, broad tropical leaves, and a loud, rushing artificial waterfall. The only way in or out was a narrow concrete opening. We slipped into the steaming water, laughing, pouring drinks, and enjoying the absolute privacy of the late-night ambience. The loud rushing of the waterfall drowned out our voices, giving us a false sense of total isolation. At least, we thought we were isolated. About 20 minutes into our soak, I leaned back against the warm jets and let my eyes wander across the dense wall of foliage directly across from us. Through a tiny, jagged gap in the massive, wet green leaves, I saw a sudden, sharp movement. At first, my brain tried to process it as a resort employee walking the perimeter path, but as I focused my eyes into the dark gaps of the branches, the terrifying reality set in. Someone wasn't just walking by. They were aggressively crouched down in the wet dirt, hidden deep inside the bushes. They were leaning heavily forward, their face pressed right against the leaves, practically salivating in the dark as they spied on us in the hot tub. A surge of pure adrenaline violently spiked in my chest. I didn't think, I just reacted. I yelled out a loud, aggressive, "Hey!" and immediately vaulted myself over the stone edge of the hot tub. My bare feet slapped hard against the cold, wet concrete. I sprinted toward the narrow opening of the bushes, ready to confront whoever was hiding there. But by the time I rounded the corner, the pathway was completely empty. I caught a fleeting glimpse of a dark figure sprinting away, instantly swallowed by the pitch-black shadows of the resort's winding pathways. Julie was shivering, desperately begging me to just let it go and come back to the water. But the romantic vibe was completely, irredeemably dead. We were deeply unsettled, the heavy realization that we were being hunted settling over us. We quickly wrapped ourselves in thick towels and started the long, incredibly uncomfortable walk back to our private suite. The layout of the resort suddenly felt less like a paradise and more like a massive, sprawling trap. The pathway back to our room was poorly lit. On our left were the towering walls of the resort buildings, and on our right was the dense, impenetrable wall of the pitch-black jungle. Every single step felt agonizingly loud. Just as we reached the heavy wooden door of our ground-floor suite, a violent, thrashing rustle erupted from the thick jungle canopy just 10 feet to our right. This was a tropical environment. We had heard iguanas and monkeys all week, but this sound was entirely different. It was massive, intentional, and carried the unmistakable weight of a grown man pushing through heavy branches. Julie gasped, aggressively pulling on my arm, begging me to open the door. I fumbled with the wooden keycard, my hands shaking violently. As the green light finally flashed and the lock clicked, I paused for a fraction of a second and listened to the dark wall of trees. Coming from the blackness of the jungle was a low, rhythmic, guttural humming sound. It wasn't an insect. It wasn't an animal. It was the deeply unsettling, vibrating hum coming directly from a human throat. Someone was standing just feet away from us in the pitch dark, watching us struggle with the door. I shoved Julie inside, threw my entire body weight against the heavy wooden door, and slammed the deadbolt shut. My heart was hammering so violently against my ribs, I thought it might crack them. Julie hadn't heard the humming, but she had heard the heavy footsteps retreating deeper into the brush the second our door slammed. We checked every single lock in the room twice, crawled into bed, and prayed for the sun to come up. The next day, surrounded by the safety of hundreds of people on the bright sunny beach, we desperately tried to convince ourselves that we had overreacted. We reported the incident to a passing staff member, rationalizing that it might have just been a drunk guest wandering where they shouldn't be. A few hours later, while we were laying on our beach chairs, a man approached us. He was dressed flawlessly in the resort's pristine white staff uniform, a high-end digital camera hanging around his neck. With a wide, enthusiastic smile, he asked us if we wanted a complimentary photo for the resort's promotional material. We happily obliged, putting our arms around each other and flashing our best vacation smiles. He snapped the picture, thanked us profusely, and walked away. We watched him go, fully expecting him to stop at the next couple to take their photo. Instead, he just kept walking, completely ignoring everyone else on the beach, until he disappeared behind a row of palm trees. It was deeply odd, especially since every single staff member we had interacted with all week had been a native Costa Rican, and this man was incredibly pale, sticking out like a sore thumb. But in the bright daylight, we brushed it off. That night was our final night before our early morning flight back to the States. Exhaustion from the previous night's terror had finally caught up with us. We packed our bags, ate a quick dinner, and crashed into bed incredibly early. Our suite had a massive floor-to-ceiling glass patio door that faced the private resort grounds. Because the ocean breeze felt so incredible, we decided to leave the heavy glass door slid open, but we firmly locked the thick mesh screen door to keep the tropical bugs out. We fell into a deep, heavy sleep, lulled by the distant sound of crashing waves. Sometime between midnight and 1:30 a.m., I was violently jolted awake. The bedroom was absolutely pitch black. I lay perfectly still, my eyes wide open, straining my ears to figure out what had pulled me from my sleep. The only sound was the wind rustling the palm trees outside. I tried to calm my racing heart, convincing myself it was just a nightmare. Then, I heard it, just inches away from the foot of our bed, coming directly from the other side of the mesh screen door, was a sharp, distinct, mechanical sound. Beep. Click. My blood instantly turned to ice. It was the unmistakable electronic sound of a digital camera, focusing and snapping a picture in the dark. I slowly, silently, sat straight up in bed. The moonlight was casting a pale silver glow across the patio. Standing right there, pressed so closely against the thin mesh screen that I could hear his shallow breathing, was a towering, pitch-black silhouette of a man. He wasn't walking past. He wasn't lost. He was standing completely motionless on our private patio, quietly taking photos of us sleeping in our bed. A primal, explosive rage and terror overtook me. I roared at the absolute top of my lungs, a deafening, guttural scream that echoed through the entire suite. The dark silhouette violently flinched, almost dropping the camera, before tearing off into the darkness, his heavy boots pounding aggressively against the manicured grass. Julie woke up screaming, completely disoriented. I launched myself out of bed, slammed the heavy glass door shut, locked it, and dialed the front desk, screaming into the phone that there was an intruder on our patio, and we needed security immediately. When the guards finally arrived, I aggressively detailed everything. The hot tub, the humming in the jungle, the man on the beach with the camera, and now this. The security manager's face went completely pale. He quietly informed us that they did not employ any photographers to walk the beach. The next morning, as we were checking out at dawn, our bags tightly gripped in our hands, the manager pulled us into a back office to show us the security footage they had reviewed overnight. The man on the beach wasn't a staff member. He was a dedicated stalker who had somehow bypassed the resort's security perimeter. The grainy black and white tapes showed him creeping around the resort for 2 entire days. He wasn't robbing rooms. He wasn't bothering other guests. He was exclusively hiding behind concrete pillars and tropical plants, obsessively following us and taking hundreds of pictures. We threw our bags into the airport shuttle and left immediately. We made it back home safe, but the psychological damage was permanent. I will never look at a luxury resort the same way again, forever haunted by the terrifying, unanswered question of what that man actually planned to do with those photographs. Sometimes the most dangerous, life-threatening situations don't happen when you are exploring exotic countries or staying in isolated cabins deep in the woods. Sometimes they happen right on the highway, completely by chance, when you are at your absolute most vulnerable. I have always hated driving long distances at night. There is a deep, psychological isolation that sets in when you are the only car on a pitch-black interstate for hours on end. But last year, I found myself with a week and a half off from my job in South Carolina, and I decided to make an impromptu road trip back home to Massachusetts to surprise my aging parents. My father had severely injured his back and couldn't travel, so I wanted to do something nice for them. To avoid the miserable East Coast traffic, I made the brilliant decision to drink 3 cups of black coffee and drive straight through the dead of night. For the first few hours, it was actually peaceful. I had my podcast playing, the roads were completely empty, and I was making incredible time. But then, I hit the state line of Pennsylvania. I mean no disrespect to the people who live there, but driving through the winding, endless Appalachian mountains of Pennsylvania in the middle of the night is a suffocating experience. The roads are incredibly dark, curving endlessly around massive rock walls and steep drop-offs. But the worst part is the fog. On this particular night, the fog wasn't just a light mist. It was a heavy, impenetrable, blinding white wall that swallowed my headlights completely. It felt like I was driving through a heavily clouded fishbowl. My visibility was reduced to absolutely zero, forcing me to grip the steering wheel until my knuckles turned bright white, staring intensely at the faint yellow lines painted on the asphalt, just to keep the car on the road. About 5 hours into the drive, my GPS lost its signal completely. Right as the navigation screen went blank, the faint glow of orange construction signs emerged from the thick white mist. A massive accident had completely shut down the main interstate, forcing all traffic onto a mandatory detour route. I followed the glowing arrows, exiting the highway and plunging deep into a desolate, winding 2-lane back road. I drove for what felt like hours through the absolute middle of nowhere. There were no streetlights, no gas stations, no houses. Just endless dark woods pressing tightly against both sides of the narrow pavement. The sheer mental exhaustion of staring into the blinding fog was physically breaking me down. Highway hypnosis began to take over my brain. My eyelids felt like they were made of lead. I desperately needed to pull over and close my eyes for just 5 minutes, but there was absolutely no shoulder on the road, just deep, black ditches on either side. I promised myself I would pull into the very next gas station. I never made it. I couldn't fight the exhaustion any longer. My eyes fluttered shut for just a fraction of a second. But at 60 miles an hour, a fraction of a second is all it takes. I violently jerked the steering wheel, but the tires instantly lost traction on the damp asphalt. The horrifying, deafening crunch of metal twisting against concrete echoed into the foggy night as my car smashed violently through the rusted guardrail. The entire world flipped upside down. The car launched off the embankment, rolling aggressively down a steep ditch before slamming hard into the muddy earth, right side up. The silence that followed the crash was the loudest thing I have ever heard. I was hanging suspended in my seat, entirely covered in shattered glass, gasping for air. I aggressively unbuckled my seatbelt, kicked the jammed driver's side door open, and crawled out into the freezing mud. I was shaking uncontrollably, standing at the bottom of a dark ravine in the middle of a cold, foggy night, staring at my completely destroyed vehicle. My phone screen was shattered, displaying a bold "no service" warning. I was miles from civilization, completely and utterly stranded in the dark. I sat down on a wet rock next to my mangled car, burying my face in my hands, trying to suppress a massive panic attack. I had absolutely no idea what I was going to do. Then, cutting through the thick, suffocating fog above me, I saw a faint, pale glow. 2 dull headlights were slowly creeping down the desolate road. I jumped to my feet, ready to scream for help, but before I could even open my mouth, the vehicle slowly rolled to a stop right above my ditch. It was a massive, beaten-up, severely rusted old pickup truck. It sat idling in the fog for a long, terrifying moment. Then, the reverse lights clicked on. The truck slowly, deliberately backed up until the tailgate was perfectly aligned with my wrecked car. The heavy passenger side window rolled down, revealing an elderly couple sitting in the cab. The woman leaned her head out the window, her face deeply wrinkled, offering a wide, unnatural smile. In a gravelly voice, she pointed out that I looked like I had taken quite a spill and asked if I needed some help. The overwhelming relief of seeing another human being instantly evaporated the second I looked at her eyes. Something was deeply, inherently wrong with the situation. I didn't want to be ungrateful, but every primal survival instinct in my body was screaming at me to run into the woods and hide. I hesitated, but politely nodded, telling her I just needed a ride to a gas station with a working phone. The massive, silent old man in the driver's seat turned off the engine and stepped out of the truck. He didn't look at me, didn't ask if I was hurt. He just walked to the back of the truck and began unspooling a heavy metal tow chain. While he was doing that, the old woman stepped out of the passenger side and began walking down the muddy embankment directly toward me. As she got closer, a stomach-churning, repulsive stench hit my face. It was the heavy, sickening smell of unwashed clothes, copper, and something deeply rotting. She completely ignored social boundaries, aggressively stepping directly into my personal space. She practically backed me into the side of my wrecked car, forcing me to move toward the rear of their pickup truck, just to keep a few inches of distance between us. She wasn't making normal small talk. She was rambling in a frantic, unhinged, rapid-fire tone about the government, the terrain, and how nobody ever comes down this road anymore. As she spoke, she was physically bumping her bony shoulder into my chest, herding me up the embankment like a sheep. I kept nervously nodding, desperately looking at the old man, hoping he would just hook up the chain so we could leave. Suddenly, she stopped her crazy ranting. Her eyes went completely wide, completely devoid of sanity. She grinned, showing a row of decaying teeth, and grabbed my forearm with a grip that was shockingly strong for a woman her age. She whispered that she had something incredibly special sitting in the bed of their truck, and she absolutely needed me to look at it right now. I tried to politely decline, telling her I just wanted to focus on the car, but she relentlessly pressured me, physically blocking my path back down to the ditch. I reluctantly turned my head and glanced over the rusted tailgate. Laying in the bed of the truck was a massive, dirty, dark blue plastic tarp, and underneath it, I could clearly see the distinct, heavy outline of a human body. Before my brain could even process the absolute horror of what I was looking at, the old woman stepped back and shrieked a name at the absolute top of her lungs. The blue tarp violently flew back. A young, deranged-looking man, covered in dirt and wearing heavy work boots, launched himself up from the truck bed, In his right hand, he was gripping a massive serrated hunting knife. He let out a breathless grunt and swiped the heavy blade directly at my face. Operating entirely on pure, blinding adrenaline, I threw my entire body weight backward. My feet slipped in the wet mud, and I collapsed hard onto my back, the sharp tip of the knife slicing through the cold air mere inches from my nose. The old woman instantly started screaming frantically at the young man, berating him for missing. I didn't wait to see what he would do next. I scrambled to my feet, my boots slipping in the mud, and I bolted. I didn't run down the road. I sprinted straight into the pitch-black, freezing Pennsylvania woods. I crashed aggressively through thorny bushes, tearing my clothes and ripping the skin off my arms and face. I could hear the heavy, thudding footsteps of the young man violently snapping tree branches right behind me. I pushed my body harder than I ever have in my entire life, dodging massive pine trees in the absolute dark, guided only by pure terror. Finally, I dove headfirst behind the massive, rotting trunk of a fallen oak tree. I buried my face deep into the wet, freezing mud, clamped my hands over my mouth, and held my breath until my lungs burned, terrified that the sound of my violently pounding heart would give away my position. I lay there paralyzed in the darkness for what felt like an eternity. The heavy footsteps of the young man eventually faded as he searched in the wrong direction. But then, the true psychological torture began. Echoing through the dark, foggy woods, cutting through the deafening silence of the night, came the old woman's voice. She wasn't yelling. She wasn't screaming in anger. She was slowly pacing through the trees, speaking in a sickeningly sweet, conversational, grandmotherly tone. "Come on out, sonny boy." Her voice drifted through the fog, sounding like it was just 20 feet away. "We got your car unstuck for you. We don't want to hurt you, sonny boy. Come out where we can see you." The horrific contrast between her violent, deadly trap and her soft, comforting voice made my blood run completely cold. I lay frozen in the mud for hours, listening to her whistle and call out my new nickname, desperately waiting for the sun to rise. When the first pale light of dawn finally broke through the fog, the woods went completely silent. I waited another hour before I finally found the courage to creep out from behind the fallen tree and sneak back to the road. The rusted truck was completely gone. My wrecked car was still sitting at the bottom of the ditch, but it had been entirely gutted. All 4 doors were violently ripped open. My luggage had been torn apart and looted. But the detail that made my stomach turn was the interior. They hadn't just robbed me. They had used that massive hunting knife to aggressively slash and completely destroy every single seat in the car. It was a clear message. This wasn't a robbery. This was a hunt. I walked for 6 miles down that desolate road until I finally found a 24-hour gas station. I walked inside covered in mud, blood, and ripped clothing, begging the cashier to call the police. When the authorities finally arrived, they took a quick report, but I could tell by the looks on their faces that they had no intention of actually looking for the truck. They called my brother, who drove 5 hours to come pick me up. I survived those woods, but the terrifying reality of what almost happened to me that night still keeps me awake. I will never drive alone at night again, and I will certainly never drive through Pennsylvania. But as terrifying as that night was, my next trip proved that monsters don't just hide in the dark woods on lonely highways. Sometimes they are standing right out in the open. Sometimes they look perfectly normal, and sometimes they smile right at you in broad daylight. When people think of a tropical vacation, they almost always picture the same idyllic scenario: warm white sand, crystal clear blue water, and a complete escape from the exhausting grind of daily life. For my girlfriend Allie and me, a getaway wasn't just a luxury, it was an absolute necessity for our mental health. We both work full-time as emergency room nurses in a massive, severely understaffed hospital in New Hampshire. Our daily lives are consumed by trauma, chaos, and the unrelenting stress of trying to keep people alive. By the time summer rolled around, we were both completely burnt out, running on nothing but caffeine and fumes. We desperately needed a break. We booked a 2-week trip to a beautiful, highly rated resort in Key West, Florida. Because Allie has a paralyzing fear of flying, we decided to make the 24-hour drive down the East Coast. We took our time, stopping at small coastal towns along the way, letting the heavy burden of the hospital slowly melt off our shoulders. When we finally arrived at our resort, it felt like an absolute dream. We had a gorgeous suite just steps away from the ocean. For the first 13 days, The trip served its exact purpose. We slept in, drank frozen cocktails, swam in the warm salt water, and completely forgot about the outside world. But our final night in Key West aggressively reminded me that no matter how beautiful your surroundings are, and no matter how safe you feel, absolute nightmares can walk right up to you in plain sight. It was our last evening before the long drive back to reality. The weather was absolutely perfect. The heavy, oppressive daytime heat had broken, leaving behind a warm, incredibly comfortable tropical breeze. The beach was entirely deserted. The sky was clear, and a massive bright full moon was reflecting perfectly off the calm black ocean water, casting a pale silver glow across the sand. We had laid a massive beach towel down near the water's edge, listening to the gentle rhythmic crashing of the waves. Ali was laying comfortably with her head resting on my chest. She had her eyes closed, completely at peace. I, on the other hand, was incredibly nervous. What Ali didn't know was that I had a small velvet box burning a hole in the pocket of my shorts. I had bought an engagement ring 3 months prior, and I had been waiting for the absolute perfect, most romantic moment to ask her to marry me. This was it. The moonlit beach, the isolation, the sound of the ocean. It was entirely perfect. My heart was pounding aggressively against my ribs as I gently ran my fingers through her hair, slowly feeding her romantic, sweet lines, trying to smoothly transition into the proposal. At first, she was smiling, softly responding to my words. But then, the atmosphere violently shifted. Ali suddenly went completely stiff. Her body went entirely rigid against mine, and she stopped responding to me altogether. For a brief second, I actually thought she had fallen asleep. I softly whispered her name, asking if she was still awake. "I'm awake," she whispered back, her voice barely audible over the waves. "Don't look right now, but someone is standing right behind us." The romantic tension instantly evaporated, replaced by a cold, heavy spike of adrenaline. I slowly sat up, turning my head to look back toward the dark tree line of the resort. Standing inexplicably close to the edge of our beach towel, so close that I could literally hear the soft crunch of the sand under their feet, were 2 completely unknown strangers. It was a man and a woman, and everything about them felt inherently, deeply wrong. The woman was objectively beautiful, but her eyes were entirely empty. They looked like black glass reflecting the moonlight, completely devoid of any human emotion or warmth. She had wild, dark, curly hair blowing in the wind, and was wearing a sheer beach cover-up over a dark bikini. She was tightly holding hands with the man next to her, clinging to his arm in a bizarre, almost childish way. The man was tall, with a thick, unkempt beard and long brown hair tied back into a messy bun. But it was his clothing that set off massive alarm bells in my head. Despite the warm, humid tropical night, he was wearing a heavy, thick red winter flannel shirt. It was completely unbuttoned, revealing a pale, bare chest, paired with simple dark swim trunks. They weren't walking past us. They weren't looking at the ocean. They were standing completely motionless, towering over us, staring directly down at our faces. And the most terrifying detail of all was their expressions. Both of them had massive, wide, ear-to-ear smiles plastered across their faces. It wasn't a friendly greeting. It was an unnatural, forced, physically painful-looking grin, showing far too many teeth. They just stood there in the absolute silence, smiling down at us in the dark. Ali, possessing the hardened, no-nonsense mentality of a seasoned ER nurse, was the first to break the silence. She sat up, crossed her arms, and aggressively asked, "Excuse me, can we help you with something?" The woman didn't blink. Her smile didn't waver. In a soft, whispery, almost melodic voice, she replied, "You two are quite nice. Beautiful, you know." The hair on my arm stood straight up. The delivery of the compliment was entirely robotic. I was completely speechless, paralyzed by the sheer absurdity of the interaction. Ali didn't back down. "Thank you," she said firmly. "Now please leave us alone. We're trying to have a private moment." The woman slowly tilted her head to the side, her smile widening just a fraction of an inch, stretching her skin tightly across her cheekbones. In that same haunting, melodic whisper, she simply said, "No, thank you." Before my brain could even begin to process that terrifying response, the crunching of sand alerted me to our left. Emerging from the deep shadows of the beach, a second couple slowly walked into the pale moonlight. Just like the first pair, they were dressed in bizarrely mismatched clothing. The woman had strange, asymmetrical braids, and the man had wild, uncombed hair. They walked up and stood shoulder to shoulder with the first couple, and just like the first two, they were staring down at us with the exact same wide, unnatural, unblinking, horrifying grins. The woman with the curly hair slowly turned her head, looked at the new arrivals and whispered, "Look, a new couple." My internal alarms were screaming. I desperately tried to convince myself this was some sort of sick, twisted, hidden camera prank, but the four of them slowly started shuffling forward. They didn't speak. They moved in terrifying synchronization, closing the circle around our towel until the first girl's bare foot was literally touching the fabric near my leg. I couldn't take it anymore. I jumped to my feet, placing myself directly between Ali and the man in the red flannel. I am a fairly large guy, and I tried to use every ounce of my size to intimidate them. I pointed a finger directly at the man's chest and yelled, "Take one more step, and we're going to have a massive problem." I fully expected them to back down. Instead, the absolute worst-case scenario happened. All four of them simultaneously erupted into a loud, hysterical, completely synchronized laughter. It wasn't a natural laugh. It sounded like a recording playing on a loop, devoid of any actual humor. The sheer insanity of the sound momentarily froze me. Before the laugh even finished echoing across the beach, the man in the red flannel violently lunged forward. I didn't even have time to raise my hands to defend myself. The heavy impact of his body tackled me entirely off the towel, sending me crashing hard onto my back in the deep sand. The second man instantly jumped on top of me as well. I was completely overwhelmed. Heavy, brutal fists started raining down on my ribs, my jaw, and my chest. I couldn't throw a single punch back. I was entirely focused on curling into a defensive ball, using one hand to protect my face and desperately clutching the pocket containing the engagement ring with the other. Through the chaos of the beating, I could hear Ali screaming in absolute terror. But the two women weren't fighting her. They were simply standing in the moonlight, perfectly still, watching the men violently beat me, still holding those wide, horrific smiles and laughing into the night air. Ali tried to jump on the back of the man in the red flannel, but the second woman casually reached out and violently shoved her backward into the sand. Suddenly, the men stopped punching. The man in the red flannel pinned my shoulder down with his knee and aggressively reached deep into an inner pocket of his heavy shirt. The moonlight caught his movement, and my heart completely stopped. Even though I couldn't fully see the weapon in the dark, I knew with absolute certainty that he was reaching for a knife. Operating on pure, blinding, desperate survival instinct, I realized I had exactly 1 second to act before I was killed on that beach. The first woman was standing entirely too close to the scuffle. I shot my right leg out with every single ounce of strength I had left in my body, violently kicking her directly in the ankle. She collapsed into the sand with a shrill shriek. The sudden movement and the noise violently distracted the two men for a fraction of a second. They both looked toward her. It was all I needed. I violently bucked my hips, throwing the man in the flannel off balance just enough to scramble out from underneath him. I spat a mouthful of sand and blood, grabbed Ali's outstretched hand, and we ran. We sprinted across the deep, shifting sand faster than I have ever moved in my entire life. I didn't look back. We didn't stop running until we crashed through the glass doors of the resort lobby, sprinted down the hallway, slammed the heavy door of our suite shut, and threw the deadbolt. We collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air in the dark, my face bleeding and my ribs screaming in pain. We spent the entire night sitting awake in the dark, absolutely terrified that we would hear a knock at the glass patio door. As soon as the sun began to rise, we packed our bags in a frantic panic. We checked out at the front desk before the breakfast buffet even opened, constantly looking over our shoulders, terrified that every single guest walking through the lobby was one of them. We threw our bags into our rental car and locked the doors. As I pulled out of the resort parking lot and turned onto the main strip to leave Key West forever, my blood ran completely cold. Standing right on the street corner in the bright morning sun, waiting at a crosswalk, were the two girls from the beach. As our car rolled past them, they both slowly turned their heads and locked eyes with us through the windshield. Their faces broke into those same wide, agonizing, unnatural smiles. And as we sped away toward the highway, they both raised their hands, smiling and waving enthusiastically at our fleeing car, just like old friends saying goodbye. I don't know what kind of sick, twisted game those 4 people were playing, or what they truly intended to do if I hadn't kicked that girl's ankle. But that horrifying night permanently changed the way I view the world. It's a chilling reminder that no matter how beautiful the destination is, and no matter how perfect the lighting is, you never truly know what kind of absolute madness is waiting for you in the sand.